The night was clear and crisp in the mountains. Stars dotted the dark sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Hannah Park sat by her small campfire, sipping hot tea from her battered metal cup. After a long day of climbing, her muscles ached pleasantly. This was her favorite time. Just her, the mountains, and the vast wilderness. At 32, Hannah had already lived several lives. First as a military specialist in Korea's Special Forces, then as an international security consultant, and now as one of the most respected professional climbers in Asia. The solitude of the mountains helped quiet the memories of her past missions. She was just about to turn in for the night when the first strange light appeared. At first, she thought it was a helicopter, maybe a rescue operation on another part of the mountain. But the light moved in ways no helicopter could, darting and weaving through the air like a dancer. More lights joined the first, creating a circle around her campsite. The air grew thick, with an electric tension that made her skin prickle. Her military training kicked in immediately. Hannah grabbed her survival pack and knife, but before she could move further, a beam of silvery light froze her in place. The beings that stepped out of the light weren't human. They looked like liquid mercury given form, their bodies smooth and silvery, with long limbs that moved with unnatural grace. Their faces had no features except for large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Specimen secured," one of them said in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. "Class 3 planet. Pre-spaceflight civilization. Standard acquisition protocols in effect." Hannah tried to speak, to move, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only watch as they approached, their movements precise and clinical. They examined her camp with casual interest, picking up and discarding her equipment like children with toys. "Physical condition appears optimal," another one noted. "Limited technological dependence, suitable for extended study." The beings, the Kyra, as she would later learn they were called, moved her onto their ship with the efficiency of long practice. The inside of their vessel was all curved surfaces and pulsing lights, nothing like the sharp angles and steel of human spacecraft she'd seen in movies. In the ship's medical bay, they ran their tests. Scanners hummed and chirped, mapping every inch of her body. The Kyra spoke among themselves in their musical language, occasionally switching to what seemed to be a universal translator when they wanted her to understand. "Multiple healed fractures detected," one reported, waving a hand over a holographic display. "Most consistent with high-impact trauma. Unusual for a primitive species to survive such injuries." Another Kyra moved closer, its featureless face tilting in curiosity. "Muscle density exceeds normal parameters for species classification. Neural patterns show signs of advanced problem-solving capabilities. Irrelevant." A third one dismissed. "All within acceptable variations for Class 3 species. Process for standard containment and testing." Hannah remained silent, but her mind was racing. Years of training had taught her the value of playing weak when you were strong. Let them think she was just another primitive specimen. Let them underestimate her. She had survived worse situations than this. As they prepared her for transfer to their research facility, Hannah caught glimpses of other captured beings, some humanoid, others completely alien. She memorized everything she saw: the layout of the ship, the patterns of the guards' movements, the way their technology responded to their touch. The Kyra's biggest mistake wasn't just capturing her, it was assuming that technology alone made them superior. They never considered that their primitive specimen had spent years training to observe, adapt, and overcome in hostile environments. They didn't realize that every scan they ran, every test they performed, gave Hannah more information about their weaknesses. When they finally moved her to a cell in their massive research facility, Hannah allowed herself a small smile. The Kyra thought they were starting their experiment. In reality, they had just given their test subject everything she needed to turn their own facility against them. The silvery beings had no way of knowing that their simple specimen had once led extraction missions in hostile territory, had trained other soldiers in survival techniques, and had learned to turn any environment into a potential weapon. They had chosen their test subject very, very poorly. As the cell door hummed shut, Hannah began her own observations. The Kyra wanted to study human potential. They were about to get a much closer look than they had bargained for. The first phase of any survival situation was always the same: observe, adapt, and plan. Hannah settled into her cell, already analyzing every detail. The real experiment was just beginning, but the Kyra wouldn't be the ones running it. The Kyra's research facility stretched for miles, a maze of white corridors and glass-walled chambers. Each section hummed with energy fields that kept their specimens safely contained. Hannah's cell was in Section D7, an area they used for testing what they called physically capable species. From her clear-walled cell, Hannah could see 15 other containment units. Some held beings that looked almost human, while others contained creatures she could barely comprehend. Floating clouds of light, crystalline structures that moved on their own, and things that seemed to shift between solid and liquid forms. The daily routine was precise. Every 6 hours, silver-skinned guards would patrol the corridors. They moved in groups of 3, their steps perfectly matched, like dancers in a ballet. Every 12 hours, feeding times. Every 24 hours, what they called basic testing, simple physical and mental exercises designed to establish baseline capabilities. Hannah played along perfectly. When they asked her to run on their strange treadmill, she ran at an average human pace. When they tested her problem-solving skills, she deliberately made small mistakes. The Kyra nodded their featureless heads, noting down exactly what they expected to see. But while they watched her, she watched them back. The energy fields that contained them had a slight flicker every time the guards passed, a power fluctuation they probably thought too small to matter. The feeding system operated through small portals that briefly disrupted the containment field. Each disruption lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. During exercise periods, Hannah noticed how the guards' weapons were attached to their suits through what looked like magnetic clips. Their joints moved differently than human ones, suggesting potential weak points in their physical structure. Every detail went into her mental catalog. At night, or what passed for night in the facility, Hannah tested her cell's limits. She discovered that the corners of her containment field were slightly weaker than the center. The floor panels had microscopic seams that the Kyra probably thought invisible to primitive human eyes. Even the air circulation system had a pattern she could track by watching the way it moved her hair at regular intervals. The other captives noticed her. They saw how she moved, how she watched, how she tested. The large, 6-armed being in the cell across from her started mimicking her exercises. A creature made of shifting colors began tapping patterns on its cell wall, patterns Hannah recognized as attempts at communication. The Kyra's pride made them blind to these small interactions. They saw their specimens following testing protocols and recorded their data with satisfaction. They didn't notice how information was being shared through subtle movements, through rhythmic taps, through carefully timed exercises. During one testing session, a young Kyra scientist made a crucial mistake. He left a data pad within Hannah's line of sight while recording her vital signs. The strange symbols on the screen meant nothing to her, but the layout of the facility displayed on it told her everything she needed to know. 3 main power stations, 2 security hubs, 1 central control room. At feeding times, Hannah started timing her movements to coincide with the portal openings, not trying to escape, just small things, like reaching for her food at exactly the right moment to feel the edge of the field's disruption. The guards never noticed. Why would they? She was just a primitive being following her instincts for food. Each night, she exercised in her cell, but not the simple exercises the Kyra recorded. Instead, she practiced movements designed to test her space, to strengthen exactly the muscles she would need. The guard saw a specimen maintaining physical health. Hannah was preparing for war. By her 10th day in captivity, Hannah had mapped every crucial point in her section of the facility. She knew the guards' rotation schedules down to the second. She understood how the other captives moved, what they could do, what they might be capable of if given the chance. The Kyra's reports showed exactly what they wanted to see: a Class 3 specimen showing expected adaptation to captivity. They recorded her submission with scientific satisfaction. Not once did they consider that every moment of apparent submission was actually preparation. In their pride, they had forgotten one of the most basic rules of warfare. Never assume that stillness means weakness. A predator is most dangerous when it appears to be at rest. And Hannah Park, trained in the art of warfare and survival, was the most dangerous kind of predator, one that looked exactly like prey. As she lay on her bed that night, watching the subtle power fluctuations in her cell's containment field, Hannah allowed herself a small smile. The Kyra thought they were running a carefully controlled experiment. They didn't realize they had trapped themselves in a cage with someone who specialized in turning cages into weapons. Testing Chamber 7 was a large, circular room with smooth white walls and a high ceiling. Like everything else in the Kyra facility, it was designed to be perfect, sterile, and completely controlled. Today's test was meant to be routine, just another physical assessment of their human specimen's capabilities. 3 guards escorted Hannah into the chamber. They moved with their usual fluid grace, silver skin gleaming under the bright lights. They hadn't bothered to restrain her. Why would they? She had been a model specimen for the past 2 weeks. Begin basic agility assessment, one of the Kyra scientists announced from behind a protective barrier. Standard Protocol 7. Hannah stood in the center of the room, wearing the simple gray testing suit they had given her. She looked small and harmless, just as she had intended to appear all along. The guards took up their positions, 2 by the door, 1 near her to direct the test. The first few exercises were simple: running, jumping, basic coordination tests. Hannah performed each one exactly as she had before, careful to maintain the same level of capability she had shown in previous assessments. Increase difficulty level, the scientist ordered. Begin reflexive response testing. The guard nearest to Hannah raised a device that would emit harmless but startling bursts of light, designed to test primitive species' fight-or-flight responses. It was at that exact moment that Hannah decided to show them what a human's true reflexive response could be. As the guard's arm moved up, Hannah was already in motion. She had spent 2 weeks studying how the Kyra moved, learning the limitations of their joints, understanding the blind spots in their vision. Now she put that knowledge to use. The first guard never saw her coming. She moved inside his reach before he could activate the device, her hands finding the exact point where his arm joint was weakest. A quick twist, and both the guard and the device clattered to the floor. The other 2 guards reacted instantly, reaching for their restraining fields, but Hannah was counting on that. Their movements were perfect, precise, and perfectly predictable. She had timed this moment carefully, knowing the power fluctuation that accompanied shift change would delay their weapons by exactly 1.2 seconds. That was all the time she needed. She rolled under the first energy burst, coming up behind the second guard. Their height gave them reach, but it also gave them a high center of gravity. 1 swept leg, and the guard toppled like a fallen tree. The third guard managed to activate his comm unit, calling for backup. Hannah let him. That was part of the plan. She needed to know exactly how long it would take reinforcements to arrive. Instead of trying to stop him, she focused on disabling the fallen guard's equipment. 3 quick moves, and their weapon systems were damaged beyond quick repair. The Kyra had never considered that a primitive might understand how their technology connected to their suits. By the time backup arrived, Hannah was standing calmly in the center of the room, hands raised in a gesture of submission. 3 guards lay around her, unconscious but largely unhurt. Their weapons and communication devices were scattered in pieces across the floor. The response team burst in, weapons ready, only to find what looked like a confused and frightened human specimen. Hannah made sure to tremble slightly, to keep her eyes wide and fearful. Let them think she had acted on instinct, that this was just an unexpected burst of primitive aggression. The lead scientist was already noting down his observations. Specimen shows unexpected levels of combat response. possibly triggered by stress of captivity. Recommend increased security protocols and limited direct contact. None of them questioned how a primitive human had known exactly where to strike to disable their technology. None of them wondered why she had waited until this specific moment, during shift change, to act. They saw what they expected to see, a simple creature lashing out in fear. As they led her back to her cell, Hannah kept her head down, shoulders hunched, playing the part of the subdued specimen perfectly. But inside, her mind was racing with new information. She now knew exactly how long it took for backup to arrive. She knew which security protocols they would activate first. Most importantly, she knew their weapons could be disabled with a simple strike to the power coupling. The Kyra increased security in her section, adding more guards and reducing her testing sessions. They wrote lengthy reports about primitive stress responses and the need for more careful handling of potentially aggressive specimens. Not one of them realized that their aggressive specimen had just completed her own crucial test, one that told her everything she needed to know about their emergency response procedures, their combat capabilities, and their blind spots. In her cell that night, Hannah smiled as she watched the newly posted guards patrol past her door. The Kyra thought they were being more careful. In reality, they had just given her even more chances to study their security patterns. They still didn't understand that every security measure they added was just another piece of information for her to use. Their perfect, controlled system was about to learn a hard lesson about the danger of underestimating humans, especially humans who had spent their lives learning how to turn other people's security measures against them. In the quiet hours between guard shifts, Hannah's cell block came alive with silent communication. The six-limbed being across from her, a Terran named Kür, had been the first to reach out. It started with simple movements during exercise periods, copying Hannah's stretches with all 6 arms. Then came the rhythmic taps on the cell walls, a crude but effective Morse code that spread from cell to cell. The myth in the cell to her right, a creature that looked like walking crystal, would catch the light during feeding times and reflect it in patterns. At first, the patterns seemed random, but Hannah soon realized they were another form of communication. The myth, who called themselves Ro, could transmit complex messages through light reflections. Each species had been taken from their homes, just like Hannah. The Terran were peaceful farmers, their extra limbs perfect for tending crops. The myth were artists, shaping light and crystal into stunning works. None of them were warriors, but all of them had skills that could be useful. During testing sessions, Hannah began teaching them. When the guards thought she was just exercising, she was actually demonstrating fighting stances. The Terrans' multiple arms made them naturally good at grappling moves. The myth's crystalline bodies could focus light in ways that could temporarily blind opponents. Other species joined their silent network. There were the Veth, who could squeeze through incredibly small spaces, and the Oro, who could generate small electrical charges. Each had been chosen by the Kyra for different reasons, but all shared the same desire for freedom. Hannah taught them Earth military hand signals, adapted for their different body types. 3 taps meant danger. A light flash followed by 2 taps meant guard approaching. A series of quick taps followed by a pause meant remember the plan. The Kyra never noticed these exchanges. They were too focused on their data, their tests, their perfect system. They didn't see how their specimens were changing, growing stronger, more coordinated. They didn't notice how exercise sessions became more synchronized, how their test subjects moved with new purpose. During one night cycle, Kür managed to tell Hannah their full story. The Terran had been peaceful explorers until the Kyra arrived. Now their strongest were taken for testing, never to return. The myth shared similar stories. Their worlds stripped of resources, their people treated like lab specimens. Hannah listened to these stories and taught them about Earth's history of resistance movements. She showed them how small groups could overcome larger forces through coordination and clever planning. Each species added their own knowledge, their own skills to the growing pool of resistance tactics. The Veth learned to time their movements with the power fluctuations in the containment fields. The Oro practiced controlling their electrical pulses to interfere with Kyra equipment. Even the smallest creatures in the cells found ways to contribute to their silent revolution. One day, during a group testing session, Hannah demonstrated how to turn a simple stumble into a defensive move. The guards saw clumsy specimens. Her fellow prisoners saw a lesson in using apparent weakness as strength. The message spread through their network. Play weak, grow strong, wait for the right moment. At night, lying in their cells, they practiced. The Terran worked on coordinating their multiple limbs for maximum effect. The myth refined their light signals to be more subtle, harder for the guards to notice. Every species found ways to turn their natural abilities into potential weapons. Hannah's cell became the heart of their underground network. Through taps, light signals, and careful movements, she coordinated their preparation. Each day brought new allies as word spread through the facility about the human who fought back and lived to teach others. The Kyra's reports showed nothing unusual. Their specimens were behaving normally, showing expected signs of adaptation to captivity. They noted the increased exercise activities with approval, seeing it as a sign of successful conditioning. They didn't understand that every test they ran, every measurement they took, was giving their prisoners more information about their own weaknesses. The Kyra's perfect system was becoming their perfect trap. Even the smallest victories gave them hope. When a Veth managed to interfere with a cell sensor, when an Oro successfully disrupted a guard's equipment, their network grew stronger. Each small act of defiance taught them more about their own capabilities. Hannah watched their progress with quiet pride. These beings weren't soldiers, had never wanted to be fighters. But they were learning, adapting, becoming something the Kyra had never expected. A coordinated resistance force. In the darkness between guard shifts, their silent revolution grew. Species that had never met before learned to work together, to trust each other, to believe in the possibility of freedom. The Kyra had wanted to study species adaptation. They were about to learn just how well their specimens could adapt. The network grew stronger each day, spreading through the facility like roots through soil. Soon, Hannah knew, it would be time to show the Kyra exactly what their primitive specimens had learned. But for now, they waited, watched, and prepared in the shadows of their cells, their unity growing stronger with each passing moment. The plan took shape in whispers, light signals, and careful movements. Hannah had spent weeks studying every detail of the facility, and now she began sharing her observations with the other prisoners. Each species had a role to play, carefully chosen based on their unique abilities. Kerr and the other Terran practiced their movements during exercise periods. Their 6 arms made them perfect for accessing multiple control panels simultaneously. They memorized the locations of power junctions that Hannah had spotted during her transfers between testing chambers. The Kyra never questioned why the Terran seemed so interested in stretching near the walls. They simply noted it as typical specimen behavior. The myth, with their crystalline bodies, refined their ability to bend and reflect light. Ro could now send complex messages across entire sections without the guards noticing. They would be crucial for coordinating the uprising, using their light-bending abilities to transmit signals through the facility's transparent walls. The Veth, with their flexible bodies, practiced squeezing through the smallest gaps in their cells. During feeding times, they tested how far they could stretch, measuring the exact width of the food delivery slots. Each Veth memorized the layout of the ventilation system they could glimpse through their cell walls. Hannah taught them military hand signals, adapted for each species' unique anatomy. 2 flashes of light meant wait. 3 quick taps meant move. A long light reflection followed by darkness meant attack. They practiced these signals endlessly, making them look like random movements to their captors. The Oro worked on controlling their electrical pulses with precise timing. They learned to generate charges that could interfere with the Kyra's equipment without being strong enough to trigger alarms. During testing sessions, they practiced releasing tiny bursts that looked like equipment malfunctions. Every guard rotation brought new information. The Kyra were creatures of habit, their movements so precise that Hannah could time them down to the second. She taught the others how to count the steps between guard changes, how to predict when the security cameras would sweep past their cells. The feeding system became their practice ground. Each species learned exactly how long the force fields fluctuated during food delivery, 2.3 seconds of vulnerability that could be exploited if timed perfectly. They practiced reaching for their food in ways that tested these gaps, always careful to make it look natural. During one testing session, Hannah managed to glimpse a complete layout of the facility's power grid on a carelessly placed data pad. She memorized it and spent the next 3 days sharing the information through their network. The myth reflected the layout in light patterns, passing it from cell to cell until every prisoner knew their part. The Kyra's overconfidence was their greatest ally. They never questioned why different species were beginning to move in more coordinated ways. They didn't notice how their specimens timed their activities to match facility operations. Every observation was dismissed as simple mimicry or coincidence. At night, when the facility's lights dimmed, the real preparation began. The Terran practiced movements that would let them disable multiple systems at once. The myth rehearsed light signals that would coordinate their attack. The Veth mapped escape routes through the ventilation system. Hannah kept track of it all, building a mental blueprint of their revolution. Each species had its task, its moment, its role in the greater plan. They would need to move with perfect coordination. One mistake could alert the Kyra before they were ready. The hardest part was keeping their preparation hidden. Every new skill had to be disguised as normal behavior. Every practice session had to look like routine activity. The Kyra's cameras watched constantly, but they saw only what they expected to see. Captive specimens going about their daily routines. The plan grew more refined with each passing day. The Terran knew exactly which power junctions to target. The myth had developed a complex signal system that could transmit commands across the entire facility in seconds. The Veth had mapped every possible escape route through the facility's infrastructure. Hannah watched their progress with careful attention, noting which groups needed more practice, which signals needed refinement. She taught them how to react to different scenarios, how to adapt if things went wrong, how to support each other during the chaos that would come. As the plan took its final shape, a sense of purpose spread through the cells. Species that had been defeated and docile began to move with quiet confidence. Their exercises became more focused, their movements more precise. The Kyra saw only well-behaved specimens, not realizing they were watching the birth of an army. The night before they planned to act, Hannah sent one last message through their network. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every species they've ever captured, for every world they've ever raided. Tomorrow, we show them that no cage is perfect, no system is unbeatable, and no species is truly helpless. The message passed from cell to cell, translated into light flashes, taps, and subtle movements. In the darkness, hundreds of different beings prepared themselves for what was to come. The Kyra's perfect laboratory was about to become their greatest lesson in underestimating their test subjects. The artificial night cycle had just begun when Hannah's fingers tapped out the signal. 3 quick beats, a pause, then 2 more. The sound rippled through the facility's walls, carried by the myth's light signals and the Veth's vibrations until it reached every planned sector. What followed was unlike anything the Kyra had ever seen. In Section D7, Kur and the other Terran moved first. As the guard passed their cells, all 6 arms shot through the feeding slots at precisely the right moment. The Kyra's own precise timing worked against them. The guard was exactly where the Terran expected, their equipment failing under multiple hands pulling from different angles. The myth activated next, their crystalline bodies suddenly blazing with coordinated light patterns that overloaded the security sensors. Alarms began to blare, but they were already too late. The Veth had squeezed through ventilation gaps that the Kyra had deemed too small for any living being to pass through. Hannah's cell door failed first, the Oro's carefully timed electrical pulses disrupting its control systems. She rolled out into the corridor, moving fast and low just as she taught the others. The guard's weapon was in her hands before they could react, their perfect stance useless against human combat techniques they'd never encountered. Across the facility, containment fields flickered and died as the Terran attacked power junctions with precise coordination. The Kyra's emergency protocols activated, but they had never planned for an attack from inside their own security systems. Their rigid response patterns, designed to handle single-sector incidents, couldn't adapt to simultaneous failures across multiple zones. Security breach in Sector D7. The announcement echoed. Security breach in Sector E4. Security breach in Sector C2. The list kept growing as more containment cells failed, more specimens joined the uprising, more systems fell to their coordinated assault. The Kyra guards found themselves facing opponents who knew their every move before they made it. Hana had taught the others how to use the Kyra's perfect precision against them. When a guard turned left, 3 different species were waiting. When they called for backup, the Myth's light signals had already redirected the response teams to empty corridors. In the central control room, the Kyra commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Their screens showed chaos, specimens moving with military precision, security systems failing in patterns that suggested intimate knowledge of their operations, species working together in ways they had deemed impossible. Hana led a mixed group through the facility's main corridor. The Terran disabled security systems with their multiple limbs, while the Myth kept their advance, hidden with carefully controlled light displays. The Veth scouted ahead through maintenance ducts, their bodies flowing through spaces the Kyra had never bothered to secure. When the first major security checkpoint tried to lock down, they were ready. The RO released coordinated electrical pulses that confused the sensor systems. The Myth bent light around their group, making them appear to be in 3 different locations at once. The Terrans struck from multiple angles, their 6-armed combat techniques overwhelming guards trained only for standard resistance. The Kyra's own security measures became traps. Emergency bulkheads sealed corridors, but the Veth had already sabotaged their control systems. Backup power systems activated, only to be immediately overloaded by carefully timed surges from the Oro. Every defense the Kyra activated played into plans Hana had spent weeks preparing. In Sector F1, a group of guards found themselves fighting shadows as the Myth bent light around fleeing prisoners. In Sector B3, the Terran disabled an entire security hub while appearing to be trapped in a sealed corridor. Throughout the facility, species that the Kyra had classified as primitive demonstrated levels of coordination and tactical thinking that shattered their carefully maintained data. Hana's group reached the facility's main power core, just as the Kyra finally managed to organize a proper response. But by then, the Terran had already accessed the critical systems. The Myth's light signals had spread the shutdown codes to every sector. The Oro were in position to overload the backup generators. The facility's perfect order dissolved into carefully orchestrated chaos. Specimens that had been classified, cataloged, and contained were now fighting with strategies drawn from 100 different worlds. The Kyra's superiority, based on technology and rigid protocols, crumbled in the face of adaptation and creativity. As the main power core began to fail, Hana sent one final signal through their network. 3 long taps, the sign for victory. Throughout the facility, beings of all species responded, their combined sounds creating a rhythm that shook the walls of their former prison. The Kyra's perfect laboratory, designed to study and contain the galaxy's species, had become the testing ground for something they had never considered: the power of unity, adaptation, and the indomitable spirit of resistance that crossed all species barriers. In the end, it wasn't superior technology or perfect protocols that won the day. It was the simple truth that Hana had taught them all. No system is unbeatable when those inside it work together. The Kyra had built their facility to contain specimens, but they had actually created something else entirely: a community of warriors who proved that the strongest chains are the ones that bind people together, not the ones that hold them apart. The Galactic Council arrived in massive ships that dwarfed the Kyra research facility. Their vessels gleamed like stars against the dark space, each one representing a different advanced civilization that helped maintain order in the known universe. As they approached, the facility's communication array continued broadcasting the evidence Hana and her allies had gathered. Inside the facility, the freed specimens worked together to secure their former prison. The Terran used their multiple arms to operate the complex control systems, while the Myth kept communication channels open with their light-based signals. The Veth moved through the facility's infrastructure, ensuring no evidence could be destroyed. When the Council representatives entered, they found something unprecedented. Hundreds of different species working in perfect harmony, led by a human they had never encountered before. The Kyra's carefully documented research had become evidence of their crimes, each test and measurement now proof of their violations of galactic law. Hana stood before the Council in the main control room, still wearing her prisoner's gray uniform. She had prepared carefully for this moment, gathering data from every species about their capture and treatment. The Kyra's own perfect record-keeping became their undoing as she presented file after file of unauthorized experiments and illegal containment. "We found their specimen database," she explained to the assembled council members. "Every capture, every test, every violation of sentient rights, all documented in their own words." The Myth projected the records onto the facility's walls, creating a display that couldn't be ignored or denied. The council members moved through the facility, their expressions growing darker with each new discovery. They found cells designed for long-term captivity, testing chambers that violated multiple galactic conventions, and research data that proved the Kyra had been conducting these operations for centuries. What shocked them most wasn't just the scale of the operation, but the way the freed specimens had organized themselves. Species that the Council had considered primitive were operating advanced technology, maintaining complex security systems, and demonstrating levels of cooperation that challenged many of their assumptions. The Kyra representatives, once proud and certain, now faced questions they couldn't answer. Their claims of scientific research crumbled as the evidence mounted. Each freed specimen had a story to tell, and together these stories painted a picture of systematic exploitation that horrified even the most seasoned council members. Hana watched as the council documented everything. The Terran provided detailed accounts of their captivity, their 6 arms gesturing as they explained how they were taken from their peaceful farming worlds. The Myth showed how their artistic abilities had been twisted into tools for containment. The Veth demonstrated how their natural flexibility had been exploited for experimental purposes. As the investigation continued, news spread across galactic networks. The Kyra's reputation for advanced civilization began to unravel. Species they had dismissed as primitive were now being recognized for their unique abilities and intelligence. The very beings they had sought to study were teaching the galaxy a lesson about true civilization. The Council's decision was unanimous. The facility would be shut down, its research confiscated, its operators held accountable. But more importantly, they had to reconsider their understanding of developing species. The humans, represented by Hana, had demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond their technological level. In the days that followed, Hana helped coordinate the return of species to their homeworlds. The Terran would go back to their farms, now with new knowledge and allies. The Myth would return to their crystal cities, their art forever changed by their experience. The Veth would bring stories of resistance and unity to their people. Before leaving, each species added their mark to a record of what had happened. The Myth created light sculptures that told their story. The Terran wove patterns with their many arms that would be remembered for generations. The Veth left impressions in the facility's walls that would serve as eternal reminders. As Hana prepared for her return to Earth, she received an unexpected honor. The Council asked her to help draft new guidelines for species classification, guidelines that would look beyond technology to measure civilization. Her experiences would help ensure no species would be dismissed as primitive simply because they developed differently. Standing on the observation deck of the Council ship, watching the former prison facility being decommissioned, Hana thought about everything that had happened. The Kyra had wanted to study human potential, to understand what made different species special. In their arrogance, they had created the perfect opportunity for that potential to be demonstrated. The lesson wasn't just for the Kyra. It was for every advanced civilization that thought technology alone marked superiority. True advancement, Hana had shown, came from understanding, adaptation, and the ability to bring different beings together for a common cause. As her transport prepared to leave, Hana received one final message, a combination of light signals, taps, and movements from her fellow former prisoners. It translated roughly to "Remember us, as we will remember you." She smiled, knowing that somewhere in the galaxy, hundreds of different beings were telling stories about how a human taught them that no cage was perfect and no species was truly helpless. The Kyra's perfect laboratory had become a perfect lesson, one that would be remembered across the galaxy for generations to come. They had succeeded in their goal of studying human potential. They just hadn't expected that study to end with their own downfall and the dawn of a new understanding in galactic civilization.